One thing you learn as you get older is that change is a consistent thing. So when we're looking at life's transitions, it's about realizing that every bit of life is about transition. We are constantly changing in every single moment, whether we realize it or not. A lot of times unhappiness, I think, comes because we try to keep the same script going no matter what. We try to think that we have it all figured out and just keep trying to use the same methodology, the same way we always have done things. And I think that's where a lot of unhappiness comes from, is because we tend to think that life is all sewed up and ready to go for us. But it's really embracing the idea that life is full of transitions and how you navigate that. It can be very scary if you don't like change. It can be very scary if you don't like transition. And I think often, I know I have in the past, hung on to my old ideas, my old ways of being, tried even to hold on to the way I always was and the way always things were, because I was scared of what the new would bring. I was scared of what that was like. Who would I be? How would I be? How would I act and interact with the world? And that's just a fight that you'll never, ever win. The only fight that you'll ever really win in that is to just simply kind of give up and go with the flow of the idea that life is about transition and change. And you see so many people that really try to stay, in the same paradigm, the same reality, the same way of doing things. I think that's one thing that's really happening here in this world, is that, like it or not, things are changing. And so many people are trying to go back to the old ways, quote unquote, or the good old days, quote unquote. And they never can really quite specify when was that, number one. And number two, who was that good for? Because generally speaking, if you're talking about going back to a past history, it may have been good for a certain person or type of person, but it wasn't necessarily good for all people, because I think life levels out. And what I mean by that is that generally over time, things just get better and better and easier for people as a whole, which may not be necessarily beneficial to people in part. And I think that's what we see a lot of, is that people perhaps who have had power or are currently in power are trying to stay in power and try to keep things the way they've always been for them. But I think that's the true sign of weakness. A true sign of weakness is someone who cannot embrace change, who can't embrace transition, who can't embrace the difference. I think that's what really being adults and really being grown up and really being strong in this world is all about. It's not about who can lift the most or who can afford the most or any of that. It's who can endure transition and change the best, who can keep their sense of peace and their sense of balance, and perhaps even their sense of, at the core, who they are without this identification that is constantly transitioning and changing. I mean, you see young people today who, they see themselves as a certain thing, but believe it or not, I used to be young at one time. I used to be a kid. I used to be a teenager. I used to be in my 20s and 30s and 40s and even in my 50s at one point in time. And I have changed. I'm now 61, on the road to being 62 this year. And I am no longer who I was before. And if I had stayed in that idea that I was always that, 20-year-old or whatever, and that that's the only way that life could really be seen from, I'd be a really unhappy person right now. So what I'm saying is it's not about sticking yourself into a certain identity and staying with that the rest of your life, but really at the core being of you understanding who you are, not as necessarily an identification, but more who you are as a conscious being, who you are as someone who has the ability to create your own power dynamics. I think we're really taught, that everything comes to us through someone else, that it's up to someone else to decide whether or not we're worthy of something, and that there's a certain avatar of a being that is correct, and most of us spend our entire lives trying to convince that perfect avatar that we're worthy, that we're good enough, that we qualify. And that is really us giving up our own power. The only true avatar is really one who is, I believe, connected to the divine, who's connected to others, who understands that as we help others, we also help ourselves, and that all of us are really in this together. And when I say all of us, I'm talking about all living and conscious beings. Perhaps even, the rocks and the stones, they have some type of consciousness. I'm sure one time we don't measure them by our record of time. But even rocks and stones have changed over time. If you were to, be able to really record their lifespan, you would see that they haven't always been as they are today. They're different today than they were, a couple million years ago. Well, that's just us deciding from our time perspective that, they are constant when actually they really aren't. But anyway, I always go off on these tangents. I'm so glad that YouTube is now saying the grandfather rambling, because I know I can just start on one subject and before I know it, I'm on 10 million others. But really at the core of it, it's about embracing change, embracing transition, not being scared of it, not being scared of the unknown. If you look at old cartography, old maps, you'll see on many of the oceans that it has monsters and dragons and different, types of creatures that are there to kill and destroy, and that it's really this idea of don't go there because that's where danger lies. But I really think the unknown is where life is, because I know that as I've transitioned through life, as I've changed, as I've moved through life, I've discovered that it is nothing but change and transition. It is nothing but becoming new. And as I've allowed that to be so, and given up the idea that the only perfect reality is the one I'm comfortable with, the one I'm familiar with, the one I've always had, when I've realized that I can be safe and I can move into a new idea, and that can actually help me thrive even more, it becomes this interesting life where I let go of these ideas of what safety and what abundance are. That it isn't about checking accounts and strength and necessarily even like physical health and vitality, but it's about resilience, and it's about showing up, and it's about courage, and it's about getting up one more time than you fall. That's truly what success, I think, is about, what life is about, and where we can really, help ourselves and help others to learn how to live a conscious, beautiful, strong, amazing life. So just some of my thoughts. Until later, love, peace, and release.